All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having a great start to your week. We're doing our second series preview for the Western Conference Finals. The Dallas Mavericks taking on the Minnesota Timberwolves. Going to get into all the details of that series. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. And then keep dropping mailbag questions in those YouTube comments so we can keep hitting them throughout the rest of the postseason. All right. Last but not least, before we get started, I want to talk to you guys about Game Time. We have 2 rounds left for you guys to get out and see some of these NBA stars in person. Obviously, we love watching basketball, but there's nothing like being there in person. The urgency, the star power, the environment in those arenas. You guys got to get out and see these guys live in person. This is where Game Time can give you guys a great experience buying tickets, especially at the last minute. They have all-in pricing, so you know exactly what you're going to be paying. No surprises when you go to check out. You can check out in as soon as 2 clicks, so there's no sort of convoluted process. You also get a great view of your seat before you even show up to the arena. I had a great experience with them earlier this year when I went to McHale Center to watch the Arizona Wildcats. And again, last minute, got a great deal, got a great seat. It was just a great experience. I want you guys to check it out. Take the guesswork out of buying professional basketball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and redeem code HOOPS, that's HOOPS, for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code HOOPS, HOOPS, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, let's talk some basketball. So the season series between the Wolves and the Mavs, almost useless for us in terms of results, at least. Minnesota won 3-1, but I think Kyrie and Luka only played in one of the games, and it happened to be the one that Dallas won. The 2 of the games, Luka and Kyrie missed entirely. None of the games involved PJ Washington or Daniel Gafford. So not really anything to look at in terms of the results or the numbers. Matter of fact, as I've done with some of the other series, I'm not even going to list some of the numbers. There's just no point when 2 of the games that are basically poisoning the data didn't involve either of Dallas's stars, right? So not going to get into that. I think Kyrie missed 3 of the 4 games. So we're not going to go through the numbers, but there was a lot of interesting stuff in the film. I have 12 clips of film we're going to go over at the tail end of this video to kind of demonstrate some of the coverage concepts that I'm talking about when we get into the matchups. On the gambling front, according to DraftKings, Minnesota is currently favored at -170. That's pretty substantial. They're viewing them as a clearly discernibly better team, at least going into the series. Not hard to imagine why after they impressively take down the defending champs on the road in Game 7 and at many points made them look like they were really, really struggling, right? We went into extensive detail in a film session yesterday about what Minnesota did to shake Denver's foundation. In case you guys missed that, you can find that a little bit further back on our feed. So let's start with Minnesota on offense. Early in the season, there was a lot of Josh Green on Ant, but for the most part, it was Derrick Jones Jr., and I think that's the matchup we'll see to start this series. I think Kyrie will guard Mike Conley. Luka will probably guard Jaden McDaniels, and then we'll see PJ Washington on Karl-Anthony Towns, and then obviously Daniel Gafford or Derek Lively on Rudy Gobert. Very different challenge for the Wolves than what Denver was, right? Because Denver obviously is a very fundamentally sound defense, and they have a lot of big bodies and a lot of length, but they're not a particularly athletic team, and they're not a good rim protection team. Dallas is much more athletic on the perimeter and much more athletic at the rim. Derrick Jones Jr. is a longer and better athlete than KCP. You could make a case that KCP is a better perimeter defender, depending on who you ask. They're very different types. But Derrick Jones Jr. has been an excellent perimeter defender this season and most of this postseason. And I more or less view him on that same tier. And I think he's got a little bit more length and athleticism. His weakness is he's a little thin, right? And that'll manifest in some different ways with Anthony Edwards, which we'll get to in a minute. But Derrick Jones Jr. is a much better athlete on the perimeter than most of the guys that Anthony Edwards has been going against in this postseason run. Also, Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford represent a rim protection element, and we saw that in a big way in the Oklahoma City series. Like, it flat out caused problems for the Thunder. And so when we look back at the Denver team, not only are they a weak rim protection team under any circumstances, and Jokic had a bad defensive playoff run. So not anywhere near the same level of rim protection. You can see that in the stats, by the way. Dallas has allowed just 42 points in the paint per game in this postseason run. Denver has allowed 50. So it's another level of rim protection, another level of perimeter athleticism. I do think that's going to present some challenges for the Timberwolves. Now let's take a look at the individual matchup of Derrick Jones on Ant to start. So again, I think his length will be more of a factor in ball screens than it will in ISO situations. One of the things with ISO situations for Derrick Jones, and I noticed this on the film, he's a little thin. So when Ant gets angles on him, we talk a lot about these leverage battles. Those of you guys who watched the show yesterday will remember I demonstrated a couple of plays where Cat drove by Jokic. And there was one at the top of the key where Cat pump faked and then ripped to the right, and then Jokic slid and took the contact more or less on his left shoulder, but Cat won that battle and blew through Jokic's left shoulder and got all the way to the rim and drew a foul on Aaron Gordon. That's that leverage battle. It doesn't matter how quick Derrick Jones Jr. is to beat Anthony Edwards to his spot. If he doesn't cleanly get his shoulder in the center of his sternum, if it's anywhere off to that side, Ant will just blow through that shoulder because he's so damn strong and has so much downhill force that he brings to the equation, right? So like in ISO situations, I more or less think it'll look like what it looked with KCP, which is he's just too small to handle all of that downhill force. But I do think Derrick Jones, his length will be a factor in ball screens. So when Ant's running, let's just say a traditional pick and roll with Gobert, and Gobert's rolling hard and Ant's coming over the top of the screen, in those situations, Derrick Jones being able to stay relatively attached over the top, his long arms and his ability to get contests from behind can be a factor on Ant in ball screens. I'm actually really curious to see how often Ant avoids ball screens altogether for that specific reason, because of that bracket that they can bring into the equation. In terms of coverages, they ran a lot of ice, which means they tried to deny Ant the use of the screen and funnel him away from the screen, particularly towards the sideline. And then a lot of deep drop, but there was some high drop mixed in. Now, where that becomes different, that's very different than the aggressive high drop trapping that we saw from Denver. Denver had Jokic up at the level to start the series, and over the course of the series brought him even further out to try to get Ant to get rid of the basketball. There were traps, and then in ISO situations, they were straight up doubling him. Now, this is where this is a difference between personnel, right? Jokic's strength on defense is he's got high IQ and he's good with his hands. So it actually makes sense to bring him up to the level because he's going to be more disruptive there than he could ever be at the rim because he's not a vertical athlete, right? Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, they are vertical athletes. So they actually can be more impactful back at the rim than they can be up at the level. And so I do think we'll see, at least to start the series, a deep drop coverage, icing side ball screens, trying to force him towards away from the screen and towards the sideline. But we'll see, similar to what happened with Michael Malone, if Ant gets going in some sort of serious way, we could see Kid mix things up and be more aggressive. Again, the challenge there for Ant is, do you guys remember the Milwaukee Bucks game earlier this year where the Bucks ran deep drop the entire game, and then Ant and Mike Conley couldn't score enough in the mid-range, couldn't hit enough pull-up jumpers? That's kind of the nature of that coverage. It allows you to defend things 2-on-2. The main reason why is when you're in a deep drop coverage, you keep the roller and the ball handler in front of you. And when the roller and the ball handler are in front of you, you don't have to bring that third guy in to tag the roller, which allows you to defend the action 2-on-2 and stay home off the ball, right? In a high drop, as soon as Gobert rolls, you have to tag from the weak side, which essentially is defending the action 3-on-2, which leaves openings for the skip pass, right? And so that deep drop could actually force Mike Conley and Anthony Edwards to beat the coverage by scoring. And again, driving into rim protection, that can be a problem, as we saw for Oklahoma City in the last round. So I think they'll start with a deep drop coverage, and then if Ant just gets cooking and starts averaging, 37, 38 a game in the early portion of the series, that's where I think we could see them get a little bit more aggressive in their coverages. For Karl-Anthony Towns, we didn't get to see PJ Washington with Dallas against Minnesota this year, but it's a similar challenge to what Aaron Gordon faced, right? And PJ's a similar type of athlete. You got to flatten out Cat's drives, beat him to spots with physicality, and force him to make shots over the top. Because when it comes time to make shots over the top, Cat can be somewhat inconsistent. That's what breeds his inconsistency. But we've seen Cat's won that battle a lot over the years, or over this playoff run, I should say. Specifically in Game 7, like he beat Christian Brown to the basket, he beat Reggie Jackson to the basket, he beat Jokic to the basket twice. Like he was slashing a lot in Game 7. And so if you lose control of that situation, that can go south for you. But PJ Washington's challenge is going to be to contain that. I think a big story of this series is going to be in the event that Ant runs into some issues with the rim protection and Derrick Jones Jr. One of the other advantages Dallas has, Minnesota, I'm getting all my teams confused. One of the advantages Minnesota has is they've got Cat and Naz Reid to attack size mismatches. And there are just a lot more size mismatches for Minnesota to attack in this series than they had in the Denver series. So that'll be a different direction for them to go. Keys for both teams on the Dallas front. Again, I think you start with deep drop, try to keep the bracket tight around Ant. That means back pressure from Derrick Jones, the drop coverage is offering those contests on those mid-range shots, right? I think you start there and just wait to see if Ant can burn you consistently. With the straight ISOs, when Ant wants to try to attack Derrick Jones just in like a slashing situation without a screen, that's where you're going to have your rim protectors sitting off of Gobert, just sitting in the paint. It's more or less the same type of coverage situation, right? Ant's going to have to beat people off the dribble and then make contested mid-range jump shots. Flatten out Karl-Anthony Towns drives like we talked about. And then lastly, this kind of is connection between both ends of the floor, but offensive process for Dallas is going to be huge in this series. They have struggled with turnovers at times during this postseason run, and if you do that against Minnesota, that's a death sentence, just like it was against OKC, because they can get out and transition so well. On the Minnesota front, don't fall for the trap that Oklahoma City fell for. Don't drive and repeatedly try to finish over their rim protection. We'll see. Maybe Ant is just such a superior athlete that he just cooks those guys at the rim all series. Maybe that's what he does. But if early in the series it becomes clear that you can't regularly finish over the rim protection, that's where rim decisions will become a huge factor. Once you get into that spot, making the right kick out passes and not falling for the trap that Oklahoma City ran into, repeatedly challenging the rim protectors. Cat and Ant's shot making, and I'm going to throw Conley in here too. Elite rim protection calls for more mid-range shot making. That's just kind of the natural kind of order of things, right? Like Jason Kidd's going to do everything he can to keep that length directly under the basket and to make things difficult for you around the rim. So over-the-top shot making will be key. And then lastly, similarly to what we talked about with Dallas, transition opportunities. So Minnesota needs to look to run as much as possible to avoid that loaded up rim protection. Moving to Dallas on offense, I think we'll see Jaden McDaniels on Luka, Anthony Edwards on Kyrie Irving. Mike Conley will probably guard Derrick Jones Jr. Karl-Anthony Towns will likely guard PJ Washington, and then obviously Gobert on Gafford or Lively. Wife's calling me. Let me just turn that off real quick. So let's talk about Gobert ball screens first. So one of the things I noticed on film, they were a little bit more aggressive with Gobert than I was expecting. There was some high drop, some trapping, some low drop, but mostly against Kyrie than I noticed in the film. Luka, though, for the most part, didn't look to target Gobert. He was mostly going after Karl-Anthony Towns in ball screens. And in those situations, at first they were doing a lot of switching, but Luka was just easily getting to his step back jump shot on Cat. And then they started hedging. And then when they got to the hedging, they would just basically drive. Luka would drive past Cat and then try to turn the corner and trying to kind of keep that head of steam going against Jaden, which obviously opens up things in the slip as well. And I think that's going to be kind of the direction this series goes, is a lot of attacking Conley and attacking Cat, those guys hedging, and then guys like PJ Washington and Derrick Jones slipping out of that and them trying to play 4-on-3 against Minnesota in rotation. So the rotations are going to be the key of the series defensively for Dallas. Let's get to those keys. So with Dallas, hunt the entry points. Again, if you similar to what we were talking about with Minnesota on offense, if you play into their bracket, meaning if you just keep attacking Gobert and Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards all series long, I think you're going to run into some issues. I do think you want to attack Ant for a reason we're going to talk about in a minute. But if you attack their best defensive players, especially in the biggest moments when they're really, really engaged, I think that could go south pretty quickly. So attacking Conley and Cat, they're going to hedge or trap. So that's where you're going to get your 4-on-3s by slipping out of those. And then it's going to be about decision-making and shot-making in those 4-on-3s. The second piece, put Anthony Edwards in screens. He has a lot of offensive responsibility for this team, right? And as we've seen throughout this playoff run, when he gets tired, his screen navigation tends to suck, right? You can get a lot of switches that way where Ant will die on the screen and then you end up having to put, a Karl-Anthony Towns or somebody like that on the ball, which is where Kyrie and Luka can look to go to work. So especially in lower leverage moments, because we know what Ant can do when the high leverage moments are there. As bad as Ant was navigating screens early in the series, like in game 3 and 4 in particular, in game 6 and 7, Ant was just an absolute menace on the ball. And like we talked about in that video yesterday, straight up removed Jamal Murray from the game by chasing him over the top of screens and funneling him into their size. So like, I don't see that as an issue when the shit hits the fan. I don't see that as an issue in the big high leverage moments. But during the meat and potatoes of the series, put Ant in a bunch of screens, because if he dies on screens, that'll generate some openings for you on offense. And then last, take care of the basketball. If you start turning the basketball over, it will be a problem. Again, Dallas was the highest turnover percentage team of the remaining 4 teams that we have in the conference finals. Use your length, use your athleticism. You can cause some problems there, right? So Dallas has to take care of the ball. On the Minnesota front, game plan discipline for Conley and Cat. Again, what that means is good hedges that cut off the driving lanes. If you throw a good hedge, you will cut off the drive and force them to quickly pass. From there, it's just rotation basketball. That's like being on a string, every guy knowing what their next rotation is and just getting back into your spots out of it, which is something I think that Minnesota has demonstrated they can do, especially through all of their double teams of Jokic over the course of the last round. Dallas showed some vulnerability to turnovers, like I talked about earlier. So just using your length and athleticism to get out in transition. And then lastly, physical ball pressure on Luka. Like we saw last round with Lu Dort, if you just beat the hell out of Luka all series long, he's going to have moments, especially when he's missing shots, where he gets super frustrated. He starts focusing on the refs. He starts to his body language starts to overly emphasize what's going on with his knee. He just kind of loses focus on the game at hand. We saw that a couple times in the last round. And so try to play Luka into those tendencies by being physical, by trying to frustrate him. Kind of similar to what we saw from Jamal Murray in game 2 in the last round. Like you can fluster a team, you can fluster a player with extensive ball pressure. My predictions. Again, I view this as a very different type of series than the last round, because Dallas is just an entirely different type of athletic matchup for Minnesota. Dallas, again, we don't think of them as an elite defense because of some of their metrics from the regular season, but they were an elite defense to end the season. They were elite defense in the first round against the Clippers, and they were an elite defense in the last round against Oklahoma City. We have to start thinking of them as one of those top-tier defenses in the league, and it all stems around elite point-of-attack defense from Derrick Jones and P.J. Washington and Josh Green when he's in the game, and rim protection from Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively. I think it's a very different challenge, and I do think they will play Minnesota into some really bad offensive stretches, which is why I'm picking Minnesota. But in 6 games, I do think that Dallas is going to get some wins against Minnesota by playing their offense into bad stretches. That said, I think the overwhelming physical assault of Minnesota, just like we saw with Denver, has the ability to rattle the foundation of an offense. They can go through some stretches where they absolutely strangle even truly elite offenses. Denver, again, has that has been one of the best half-court execution teams of the last 5 years. And there were stretches where Minnesota didn't just slow them down, but made them lose composure. That is the ability that Minnesota has to break your foundation. And I do believe that in the aggregate of this series, they will have more wins against Dallas's offense than Dallas's defense does against Minnesota's offense. The last kind of piece to look at here is Anthony Edwards versus Luka. I did a thing with the Nerd Sesh guys on Friday, I think last week. It was after game 6 of Minnesota-Denver. And in that stretch, if you guys remember, I talked about how, for me, Anthony Edwards is fast on the rise, but I would probably take a healthy Luka over him at number 2 right now. I just think he's a little bit better as a half-court surgeon, right? But the problem is Luka's knee has been messed up. and he hasn't been nearly as consistently good as he's been in previous playoff runs, right? And so with the knee injury kind of being factored in, I think that Ant is more or less like kind of on the same level as Luka and has a chance to outplay him here. And that's the thing is like if you were trying to put together a pathway for Dallas to win the series, it's pretty simple. Derrick Jones Jr. and rim protection stifle Minnesota's offense, and Luka gets back to that like consistent top tier superstar level that he just hasn't been at in this postseason run. So like that's the thing is like he wasn't able to get there against Oklahoma City often. He wasn't able to get there often against the Clippers. He had moments, but it was not the same consistently great Luka that we're accustomed to seeing in the playoffs for the most part, right? So what makes you think he's going to suddenly figure it out against Minnesota, right? Minnesota's just a better defense than any of these other defenses that he's faced. That said, Luka conquering that challenge is the pathway. If he can conquer that challenge, I do believe Dallas's defense will slow Minnesota down for extensive stretches. So if Luka can solve this Minnesota defense consistently, that is Dallas's pathway to win the series. That said, I am picking Minnesota in 6. I'm super excited for this series. Lots of interesting basketball kind of chess pieces moving around. Tons of star power between Anthony Edwards, Kyrie Irving, Luka, and I think we got to include Karl-Anthony Towns in there now after how he's been playing in this postseason run. Can't wait to get into it live on YouTube after the final buzzer of Game 1 on Wednesday night. Now, before we get out of here, let's take a look at some film. We're going to talk about some of these specific concepts. We're this close to crowning a new NBA champ, and with the action heating up on the court, it's even hotter at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. There's only so many games left, and DraftKings Sportsbook has you covered with same-game parlays, live betting, odds boosts, and so much more. Don't miss out, or you'll have to wait until next NBA season to place your bets. It's super easy for first-timers to get started. Try betting on something simple, like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your squad, and place your first bet. It's that simple. The championship odds right now, as we head into the conference finals, according to DraftKings, Boston's at -150, the Timberwolves at +275, the Mavericks at +500, and the Indiana Pacers, a long shot, at +2,500. New to DraftKings, listen up. New customers can get a no-sweat bet up to $1,500. Just deposit at least $5, and you'll get a bonus bet back equal to your first bet if it doesn't hit. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code HOOPS. That's HOOPS. That's code HOOPS for new customers to get a no-sweat bet up to $1,500 if your first bet doesn't hit. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. So this first clip is just an example of some of that screen navigation I was talking about with Anthony Edwards. So we're going to get a basic Kyrie Irving ball screen with Rudy Gobert here on the left side, okay? Now watch as Gobert comes to set the screen. Watch Ant just more, or not Gobert, excuse me, as Dwight Powell comes to set the screen, Ant just kind of dies on it. And when he dies on it, Kyrie's able to kind of find this soft spot in the middle of the floor and knock down a pull-up jump shot over Rudy Gobert. Again, I think that Dallas, especially early in the series when the urgency isn't quite there, can look to target Anthony Edwards in screens because that's where he conserves energy in basketball games is screen navigation. But again, when the shit hits the fan, he's still incredibly good at it, as we saw in the Jamal Murray matchup in Game 7. Here's an example of a very similar type of screen that Ant switches. This time from Josh Green. Again, like this should probably be a hedge and recover in this playoff series, but Ant just kind of dies on the screen, right, and stays. And so Mike Conley ends up on an island against Kyrie, and then Kyrie takes him to work on the left block and hits a little left shoulder fade. So again, that's that matchup attacking piece that I was talking about. If you just concede those switches, you're playing directly into Dallas's hands. So screen navigation, hedging and recovering, good rotations are going to be key to slowing that down. We're going to move over to the other side of the floor here and talk about Anthony Edwards for a minute. These are some examples of ball screen coverages on Ant pick and rolls. So this actually in live, you could see Derek Lively yelling right here. In the actual live broadcast, you can hear them screaming ice. So this is supposed to be an ice coverage. What that means is we're here on the sideline. Derrick Jones Jr.'s job is to not let Anthony Edwards use the screen, but force him away from it. And you can actually see Derrick Jones jump way on the high side to force Ant to go away from the screen. But Derek Lively, this has to be botched. because in an ice coverage almost always has a deep drop. And the main reason why is if Derrick Jones is conceding a drop, or I should say, if Derrick Jones is going to deny the use of a screen, he's almost certainly going to give up dribble penetration going the opposite direction, because that's the whole point. You're like saying, I cannot let you go this way, therefore you're probably going to be able to go the other way. And Derek Lively ends up on the wrong side of the screen here. So when Ant rejects, there's just nobody, there's no real length at the rim, and he's able to just challenge Dante Exum and score there. So that was kind of a botched example of the ice coverage. But I put that in there because you could actually hear, obviously you can't hear because I have the sound turned off, but you could actually hear Derek Lively call that out. So that's probably the coverage they're going to use for the most part. Here's a properly executed ice coverage so you guys can see what it looks like. So again, we're going to have this ball screen here on this side of the floor. Notice Derek Lively screams out ice again. Notice this time, instead of coming way over here for whatever reason, he drops into that short corner. That's an actual properly executed ice. The whole point of the ice is you want to force Ant to drive this way into help. But one of the advantages is Derrick Jones Jr. has the length to kind of bother that pull-up jumper. So as a result, Ant can't just rise up for a pull-up jumper. Also, because of Derek Lively, he can't just accelerate and go to the rim. Like, you wouldn't be able to run that type of ice coverage with a deep drop with Jokic, because Ant would just hit the jets and try to turn the corner around Jokic and get to the rim. Lively's providing some rim protection there. As a result, Ant has to turn his back to the basket, and now it's basically just an ISO, but he's trying to ISO against the guy that's got some length advantage against him, right? We get another ball screen back towards the middle of the floor, and he ends up drawing a foul on Lively because Lively leaves his feet. But again, that initial coverage before the rescreen, that's a very, very well executed ice coverage. All right, this is an example of ice with a deep drop. Let's go back here. So again, as you can see, Derrick Jones jumps way on the high side, tries to force Ant away from the screen. Notice too, I've gone over this with you guys before, but when teams ice, a lot of times the screener won't even attempt to set the screen because there's just no point to set it if he's not going to let you use it. But here we get Ant driving downhill. Gobert kind of rolls into his way, so he has to snake back across. But notice the back pressure from Derrick Jones. See, this is where I told you guys in the monologue portion, Derrick Jones's length is going to be more of a factor in ball screens, because when he's behind Ant, he can actually bother that pull-up jumper, and ends up going to kind of this like funky rise-up floater, though, and makes it. That shot-making piece in the middle of the floor is going to be key for Ant. All right, let's see here. Here's another example of a deep drop with Derrick Jones Jr. Let's fast forward a little bit. Okay, so I've got Ant, Cat setting the screen, Derek Lively in the drop. This is that bracket that I'm talking about. Notice now, Ant's got length behind him and length in front of him. That's just a different level of length and athleticism that he's facing in ball screens than he did in the last round. Once again, though, Lively ends up leaving his feet and fouling him. So again, that's good. Like again, it'll be one of those things where execution is a factor. They got to do it without fouling, but that gives you an example just in terms of the length of what it's going to look like. All right, let's move over to the other side of the ball and look at Luka ball screens. This is an example of a Luka ball screen. This is obviously Dwight Powell instead of Daniel Gafford or Derek Lively. One of the things I thought was interesting here is Gobert is setting up to show high. Like, this is not a deep drop. Like, he's coming way up to the level of the screen here, being aggressive on the ball. Powell rolls out of it, and it turns into an ISO. But I thought that was an interesting example of just how aggressive they're going to look to guard Luka when they bring Gobert into the screen. So again, like I mentioned earlier, not a whole lot of attacking Gobert, a lot more of attacking Karl-Anthony Towns. And this is kind of what that looks like. So again, quick little brush screen from Josh Green in transition. This one ends up being a switch. And Luka immediately against the switch goes to the step back jumper and knocks it down over Cat. But so when in this particular game, because Luka was cooking Cat on the switches, they ended up going to a hedge instead. And so this is what that looks like. So again, Notice Cat's trying to cut off the driving lane, but Cat, this is a bad hedge because the whole point of the hedge is you have to actually stop the drive. He doesn't do that properly. As a result, Luka cleanly gets to his spot over here on the left wing. Misses the shot, but that's a good look. So again, when I said game plan discipline, that's what I mean, is like Cat's got to do his job, which is you've got to make Luka take a retreat dribble here. So like right here, if you cut him off, he'll take a retreat dribble. If he takes a retreat dribble, then Jaden McDaniels can recover and then you can sprint back. But if you don't cut him off, then Jaden is now trying to chase him down further away, and that's just a really difficult closeout at that point. One of the things you got to watch out for, though, is the flip side. Naz Reid throws a hedge here in the similar type of action. But again, it doesn't matter if you cut Luka off if he can split, right? So that's the challenge that Naz and Cat and Conley as well, when he's on the floor, I think we'll have to do some of this. But in those hedges, you have to not allow the quick drive on the split or the quick drive on the outside. This is going to be a little bit of a contained situation. You have to force Luka to take a retreat dribble in order for this coverage to work. So you saw Cat fail by giving up the drive to the outside. Now you're seeing Naz Reid fail by giving up the split. All right, 2 more clips. Here's an example of another trap with Gobert. So again, ball screen, trap. But notice one of the things that this is a really good trap execution, because notice Gobert, as soon as Luka picks up his dribble, he rotates. Boom, pick up the dribble, rotate. But one of the things there is, in terms of timing, if Gobert's going to rotate back here, then Naz Reid needs to also, as soon as Gobert starts, to rotate to Derek Jones. But they're a little bit slow there, which generates a little bit of an advantage situation. But they rotate out of it well, because once again, you're giving up an opening underneath the rim, but you have so much size down there that there's not really an opening. So that's a really good executed trap and recover, and it even could have been better if Naz Reid was a little bit faster in his rotation. Good work there. And then lastly, this is more of a traditional high drop coverage with Gobert, which I think we'll see as well. But I didn't see a lot of low drop with Gobert on Luka. It was almost exclusively on Kyrie in the film. So this is a classic high drop, right? So we get the ball screen. Notice Gobert is near the level of the screen, but he's not like actually trapping. But Luka splits and gets into that little floater range there. Forces a miss, though. So yeah, those are some examples of the baseline coverages that kind of, I hope that gives you guys a good kind of description of the fact that it is going to be a different challenge for Minnesota with Anthony Edwards. I want to be clear, picking Minnesota, absolutely think Dallas can win this series. They have advantages that they can go to, particularly on the defensive end of the floor. And if Luka plays well enough, they can do it. But I think this Minnesota team is playing at a special level right now, so I do believe they will win. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. I will see you guys tonight after the final buzzer of Celtics-Pacers, and then again tomorrow morning for a film session on that game before we get to game 1 of this series on Wednesday night.